The night I said no, I was standing at the kitchen window in my bare feet, watching snow fall on the garden I would have to dig up again in spring. The baby was finally sleeping. The other 5 were finally sleeping. The house had gone quiet in that particular way it only does when you are the last one awake, when the whole weight of the household has settled onto you because you are the only one still holding it. My husband came into the kitchen. I knew from the sound of his footsteps what he wanted. I had known since supper. There is a particular way some man sits at a table when he has already decided something, and I had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather. The way you read the sky when you need to know whether to bring the washing in before the storm. I turned from the window, I looked at him, and I said no, not gently, not with apology folded through it, not with the careful softening I had spent 20 years learning to apply to anything that might create friction. Just no. What happened after that word is why I am standing here talking to you today. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I married at 19 years old. I had my first child at 20. By the time I said that word at the kitchen window, I had 6 children under 10 years old, a body that had been pregnant or nursing for the better part of a decade, and not one person in my community who had ever suggested that the decision of when that would end belonged even partly to me. This is Hannah the Amish Girl, the channel where we say the things that were never permitted to be spoken out loud. If you want to hear more stories from behind the prayer cap, subscribe right now and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments, did you grow up somewhere that your body felt like it belonged to something other than yourself? I read every single one. Now let me tell you what happened after I said no. Because it is not a simple story. Nothing about Amish marriage ever is. To understand what happened in that kitchen, you first need to understand what marriage means inside an Old Order Amish community. Not what it looks like from the road, the white farmhouse, the garden, the washing on the line, the children running in the yard. What it means from these inside. The Ordnung is the unwritten code that governs everything in an Amish life. It is not a document. It is not handed to you at your wedding in pages you can argue with or question or return. It lives in the air of the community. It lives in what is said, in what is never said, and most powerfully in what happens to a woman who steps outside either of those categories. Inside the Ordnung, a wife's body belongs to her husband and to God. In most Old Order districts, those two things are not distinguished from each other. The language around them is identical. Submission to one is submission to the other. Resistance to one is resistance to the other. Children inside this framework are not a choice. They are blessings. They are visible evidence of a family's faithfulness, of a woman's willingness to yield herself, of a marriage operating the way God designed marriage to operate. In my district, birth control was not discussed openly. It was not exactly a secret that it existed somewhere in the world outside our community. It was simply understood, the way many things were simply understood without ever needing to be said, that seeking it was selfishness dressed as necessity. That a wife who consistently refused her husband was in the language that would eventually be used to me directly, refusing the will of God. I had grown up watching my mother have 8 children. I had grown up watching my aunt have 11. I had watched the women around me age in a particular way, carefully, with a particular slowness in how they moved through church on Sunday mornings, and I had understood before anyone explained it to me that this was what the rest of my life would look like, not as a threat, as a fact. As the water I was swimming in, so constant I did not even register it as something I could question. There was no word in my community for what I was feeling the night I stood at that kitchen window. There was no conversation that existed that could have held what I needed to say. There was no older woman I could have sat across from at a kitchen table and said, I am 31 years old and I am already finished. I love my children with everything I have, and I cannot do this again. My body is telling me it is done, and I do not know how to honor that inside the life I am living. That sentence did not exist in the language I had been given. My 6th child, a girl we named Ruth, was born in February of that year. The birth was difficult in a way I had not experienced with the 5 before her. I spent 3 days afterward, unable to stand up fully straight. My midwife, a woman from a neighboring district who had attended more births than she had ever counted, looked at me on the second morning and said something quietly, almost to herself, that I have not forgotten. She said, "This body has been working a long time." She did not say anything else. She moved to the other side of the bed and continued her work and did not look at me again in a way that required response. But she had said it, and something in me received it in a way I could not have explained then. Ruth was 8 months old the night I said no. 8 months old and still nursing, still waking twice each night. I was operating on somewhere between 4 and 5 hours of sleep on a good night. I had a son with a chest cold I was watching closely. The last time he had a chest cold, it had moved into his lungs, and we had lost 2 weeks to the fear of that. I had dried beans soaking on the counter for breakfast. I had mending piled in the corner that I had not touched in 2 weeks. I had a daughter who had been asking me to repair her doll's dress for 3 days, and I kept telling her tomorrow. I was not making a decision when I turned from that kitchen window. I was not formulating a position. I was not prepared to argue or defend Stan. I was just a woman in bare feet on a cold floor who was too tired to be anyone other than exactly who she was in that moment, and who could not mind 1 more ounce of the careful performance that a life like mine required at every hour of every day. I turned around, I looked at my husband, and I said no. I said I cannot have another baby. I said my body has done everything it knows how to do, and I need it to stop now. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. And then he said, "That is not your decision to make." I want to be careful about what I tell you next and how I tell it, because what happened in the weeks that followed that night is not something I will lay out in detail in order to disturb you or to perform pain for an audience. That is not what this channel is about, and it is not why I am here. What I will tell you is the structure of it, because the structure is what matters. The structure is what has happened to women across more communities than mine, in more languages than Pennsylvania Dutch, for longer than any of us have been alive. A wife who refuses her husband in an Old Order Amish marriage does not only refuse her husband. She refuses the entire architecture the marriage exists inside. She refuses the bishop who blessed the union. She refuses the Ordnung. She refuses the community's understanding that her body is not entirely hers to govern, that it belongs to something larger, something she agreed to yield to when she was baptized, when she stood in front of that bishop, when she said the vows she said. Refusal has consequences. They are rarely the loud kind. Often they are the quietest kind possible. And silence, I have learned, can carry more weight than any raised voice. My husband spoke with the bishop within the week. I knew he would. That is the pathway. That is how these things move inside a community like ours. Not through confrontation, but through structure, through the apparatus that exists precisely to manage these moments and return them to order. I sat with the bishop and his wife in their front room on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The room was warm. There was a pie cooling on the windowsill. It was all very ordinary and very quiet and completely immovable. I was told that what I was experiencing was hokmut, pride, a spirit that had not fully surrendered what it needed to surrender. I was told that many women had felt exactly what I was feeling, the exhaustion, the fear, the sense of being past some limit, and that those women had trusted God and found that God provided. I was told that a willing heart would find a way, that the faith required of a wife included the faith that her body could do what God designed it to do. I sat in that chair and I nodded. I knew how to nod. I had been nodding since I was old enough to understand that nodding was what the situation required of me. It is not weakness, that nodding. I want to say that clearly. It was survival. It was the management of something I had no other tools to manage. But something had broken open in me the night I said no, and it did not close again no matter how well I performed the nodding. There was a woman in my district named Rebecca. She was 43 years old. She had 9 children. She had been married since she was 18. She moved through every Sunday service, every quilting frolic, every community gathering, with a particular stillness I had always read as deep faith. I had admired it. I had wondered, more than once, what it felt like from the inside, that kind of settled quiet. I understand now that it was something else entirely. It was the stillness of a person who has stopped fighting a current they have calculated they cannot swim against. It was not peace. It was the accumulation of years of yielding, until yielding had become the only motion available to her. Rebecca found me 2 weeks after my conversation with the bishop, at a quilting frolic at a neighbor's house. She sat down beside me without announcement and began threading her needle. We worked without speaking for several minutes. Outside the window I could hear the horses shifting in the barn and the low sound of women talking in the next room. And then Rebecca said, without looking up from the frame, "I lost one at the end." She did not explain. She did not need to. I understood what she meant. I understood that she was telling me that her body had eventually made a decision her community had not permitted her to make. That somewhere in those 9 pregnancies, something had broken in a way that had resolved the question her husband and her bishop had been answering on her behalf for 25 years. And that she had carried that knowledge entirely alone, with no one in that room or any room ever asking her what that cost had been. She finished her thread and broke it off and said, still without looking at me, You are not the first to feel what you are feeling, Martha. And you will not be the last. Then she moved to the side of the quilt. We did not speak of it again that day or any day after, but I thought about her for months. I thought about 9 children and 43 years old and the particular texture of a stillness that was not peace but its performance. I thought about what it costs a person to perform serenity for a lifetime. I thought about what we owe each other when the only thing available is 2 sentences over a quilting frame in a language that sounds like nothing important. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. The night I said no was not the last hard night. I want to be honest with you about that because I am not here to give you a story that turns cleanly in the middle. What changed was smaller and more interior than a turn. Something shifted in the way I perceived the structure I was living inside. When you are born inside a system, the walls do not register as walls. They register as the world. They feel like the horizon, like the natural boundary of what is possible, not a construction that someone built and someone else enforces. The night I said no and felt what followed from that no was the night I understood for the first time that the walls were walls, that they had been designed, that they had a purpose, and the purpose was not my flourishing. Understanding the shape of a cage does not open its door. I want to be clear about that. But it changes how you breathe inside it. And breathing differently, even slightly, is the beginning of something. I did not leave my community that year. I left 3 years later, and the leaving was slow and expensive, and nothing like the single moment of clarity that people outside plain communities sometimes imagine it must be. There is no morning you wake up and simply know. There are months of knowing, followed by months of not knowing, followed by the particular weight of what you are about to lose sitting on your chest at 4 a.m. while the house is quiet and the children are sleeping and the horses are still in the barn. What I lost when I left was real, and I will not make it smaller for the sake of a cleaner story. My community had shown up for every frolic and every funeral and every hard winter I had ever known. The women who sat across from me at every quilting frame had known me since I was a girl. When I left, their doors closed, letters came back unopened, phone calls went to silence. A community that had been the entire texture of my life became, almost overnight, an absence shaped exactly like everything I had ever belonged to. That cost does not disappear because the leaving was right. I carry it still. Since leaving, I have spoken with women from other plain communities, from more conservative affiliations and from New Order churches, and from communities that share almost nothing with mine except the underlying structure of what a wife is permitted to need. And I have spoken with women outside plain communities entirely, different faiths, different countries, different languages, and the thing I keep returning to is how consistent the mechanism is underneath all those different surfaces. It is not always Pennsylvania Dutch. It is not always a bishop in a warm room with a pie on the windowsill. But the architecture underneath, the one that frames a woman's body as existing in service of something larger than herself, that names her discomfort as faithfulness, that treats her capacity to endure as evidence of spiritual maturity, that architecture is not unique to plain communities. It is very old, it moves across borders with remarkable ease. My therapist, an English woman I began seeing in the year after I left, said something in one of our early sessions that I have turned over in my mind nearly every day since. She said, "Consent is not a door you walk through once at an altar and never revisit. It requires each time a yes that could genuinely have been a no. A yes that exists inside a real freedom to refuse. If the refusal carries consequences designed to make it functionally impossible, then the yes was never truly a yes. It was the management of an impossible situation dressed as agreement. I had been managing impossible situations my entire married life. I had nodded and yielded and been faithful in every way my community had trained me to understand faithfulness. And the night I stopped, the night I said the actual word for what I needed, I discovered how much of the entire architecture had depended on my silence. My therapist also asked me, later, what I wished someone had said to me before I was married. Not information about the wedding night, though I needed that too, and no one gave it to me. What I needed someone to say, what I believe every girl in every community like mine needs to hear before she stands before a bishop and speaks vows she does not fully understand, is this: Your body is yours. It was yours before you spoke any vow, and it remains yours after. A marriage is not a transfer of ownership. A marriage can hold two people who each remain fully themselves. That is not hochmut. That is not pride or selfishness or a failure of faith. That is the only version of marriage that does not eventually consume one of the people inside it. I was 31 years old, standing in bare feet on a cold kitchen floor, before I said a single word out loud that asserted any version of that truth. And the community I had lived inside my entire life heard that word and called it pride. I think about Ruth, 5 years old now, with a laugh that arrives without warning and fills whatever room she is in. She falls asleep in the car with her face pressed against the window and her breath fogging the glass. She has never been told that her needs are evidence of weak faith. She has never been handed a word and then taught that the word means nothing when she uses it. I am learning alongside her how to raise a person who knows her own authority over herself. We are figuring it out at the same time, my daughter and I. That is both a grief and something I do not yet have a name for that sits above the grief. I think about Rebecca, threading her needle, 43 years old, 9 children. That particular stillness. The way she said I lost one at the end, and the way I knew exactly what she meant, and the way neither of us could say anything more than that in that room. There is a network that has always run underneath the official surface of Amish community life. Women passing information sideways in whispers disguised as something else. A jar pressed over a fence without explanation. A sentence at a quilting bee that sounded like advice about cooking and was not. A mother-in-law who left something on a nightstand the morning after a wedding and never mentioned it again. Women doing what they could inside a system that gave them almost nothing to work with. Rebecca did what she could. She gave me 2 sentences over a quilting frame and moved to the other side, and that was everything she had to offer, and she offered it without hesitation. That is not enough. I need to say that plainly. 2 sentences over a frame is not a system. It is not care. It is not the preparation or the honesty that every woman deserves before she enters a marriage and begins having children and discovers that her body has become the site of a negotiation she never knew she was entering. It is the remnant of care. The crumb that falls through a system that has decided women's bodies are not worth full honesty. But it was something. Rebecca saw me and said, "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." In the absence of everything else, that was something. And I have tried, with this channel, to do more than that. To say out loud and in full the things that were only ever whispered sideways. That is why I am here. That is the whole reason. If you grew up somewhere that taught you your needs were evidence of weakness, I see you. If you were told that endurance was the highest form of faithfulness, that wanting anything different made you proud or faithless or too much, I see you. If you have ever stood somewhere, a kitchen, a bedroom, a warm front room with a bishop sitting across from you, and said no, and felt the full weight of a structure come down on that one word, you are not alone and you were not wrong. You were a person who needed something. Needing is not sin. Needing is not hochmut. Needing is the most ordinary and necessary human thing there is, and any community or structure or relationship that cannot hold your needing is not built for you. It is built for something that requires you to disappear inside it. I am still learning how to need things without apology. I am still learning the difference between surrender that is freely chosen and surrender that is slowly extracted. My children are learning it alongside me. Ruth is learning it. And someday I will find the words to tell her about the night her mother stood in bare feet at a kitchen window watching snow fall on a sleeping garden and said a word that cost everything and meant it completely. Tell me in the comments what stayed with you. Tell me if you have ever said no and felt the walls close around that word. Tell me where you are from and what the version of this looked like in your world. Because I believe these stories exist far beyond plain communities, and saying them out loud is the only way through them. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video, and that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.